The marriage record in Kentucky County Clerk's office contains an entry from February 14, 1848, that documents 2 weddings happening at the same time, 4 names written in fading ink. The record failed to reveal that within 10 years no one in those families would know who their real father was. Before we dive into the story, make sure you click the like button and subscribe so you never miss the disturbing cases we share here. Also, I'd love if you could comment below telling me where you're watching from. Now, let's continue with the story. The ceremony took place at Blackwater Creek Baptist Church, a simple wooden building that served the scattered families living in the valleys and hills of eastern Kentucky. Reverend Thomas Gaines led the ceremony, a strict man who believed in the sacred permanence of marriage vows and the divine order of family. He stood before the 2 couples with his Bible open to Genesis, reading about how God created them, male and female, how a man shall leave his father and mother and stay with his wife. Caleb and Ezra Harlow stood side by side in matching dark suits their mother had sewn from the same roll of wool. At 26 years old, the brothers were impossible to tell apart. Same height, same build, same dark hair that curled slightly at the collar, same deep, set eyes the color of creek water after a storm. Even their voices had the same tone and rhythm. Their father had died in a logging accident 3 years earlier, and their mother had died the previous winter from pneumonia, leaving the brothers with neighboring pieces of land along Blackwater Creek and a small inheritance that would allow them to build homes and start families. Ruth and Naomi Pritchard stood beside them in ivory dresses their aunt had made, their blonde hair pinned beneath matching lace veils. The sisters were 22, and like their grooms, they were mirror images of one another. Pale blue eyes, delicate features, small hands that had known hard work since childhood. Their parents had died in a house fire when the girls were 16, and they had lived with their aunt and uncle ever since, waiting for suitable husbands in a region where eligible men were scarce. The congregation of 47 people watched as Reverend Gaines pronounced both couples man and wife. There was something poetic about it, people whispered. Identical twins marrying identical twins. It seemed like fate, like God's own design. The community gathered afterward in the churchyard, sharing cornbread and preserves, speculating about how the couples would manage living so close together, joking about whether the children would all look exactly the same. Caleb Harlow shook hands with well-wishers and accepted their congratulations, but his eyes kept drifting across the yard to where Naomi stood beside his brother. She laughed at something Ezra said, her hand resting lightly on his arm, and Caleb felt something twist in his chest, a thought he couldn't name yet, a question he didn't want to ask. He looked at Ruth, his new wife, standing patiently beside him with her gentle smile, and felt nothing but hollow politeness. The 2 couples left the church in separate wagons. Caleb and Ruth headed west toward the cabin he'd built on his portion of the family land. Ezra and Naomi traveled east to the identical cabin that sat just beyond the tree line, close enough that on quiet nights you could hear a shout from one property to the other. The structures were mirror images built from the same timber, with the same stone chimneys and the same dimensions. Everything about the arrangement seemed perfectly balanced and fair. That night, as Caleb lay beside Ruth in their marriage bed, he stared at the ceiling beams and thought about his brother lying in an identical bed with Naomi just 300 yards away through the dark forest. And in that darkness, the first seed of obsession took root. The first months of marriage passed with the rhythm of frontier life. The brothers worked their land side by side, clearing fields and mending fences, while their wives tended gardens and preserved food for winter. On Sundays, both couples attended church together, sitting in neighboring pews. To the outside world, they appeared as 2 halves of a perfect whole, living in harmony that seemed almost supernatural in its symmetry. But Caleb's obsession had grown from a seed into something that consumed his every waking thought. He found excuses to visit his brother's cabin, claiming he needed to borrow tools or discuss livestock. Each visit was really an opportunity to watch Naomi, to study the way she moved through her kitchen, the sound of her laughter, the curve of her neck when she bent over her sewing. He convinced himself that some terrible mistake had been made at the altar, that God or fate had somehow crossed the wires and he'd married the wrong sister. Ruth noticed her husband's distraction but attributed it to the adjustment of married life. She tried harder to please him, cooking his favorite meals, keeping the cabin spotless, offering herself to him with increasing desperation. But Caleb's body went through the motions while his mind wandered 300 yards east through the forest. One evening in late autumn, Caleb appeared at Ezra's door after dark. Ruth believed he'd gone to check the animal traps. Naomi had already gone to bed, and the brothers sat by the fire with a jug of whiskey between them. Caleb poured generous amounts into their cups, waiting for the alcohol to loosen his brother's reasoning. Do you ever wonder what it would have been like?" Caleb asked, staring into the flames. "If you'd married Ruth instead?" Ezra shifted uncomfortably. "That's a strange question for a married man." "We're identical," continued, his voice dropping lower. "Everything about us is the same. Our faces, our voices, even the way we walk. The girls are identical too. So in a way, we all married the same person, didn't we?" "That's whiskey talking," Ezra said, but there was uncertainty in his tone. Caleb leaned forward, his eyes intense in the firelight. "What if we switched just for one night, just to know?" They'd never be able to tell the difference. We could satisfy our curiosity, and no one would ever know. No harm would come of it. Ezra stood abruptly, knocking his chair backward. "That's madness. That's sin. Is it?" Caleb pressed. "If they can't tell us apart, if we're truly identical, then what difference does it make? It's not betrayal if they never know. It's just curiosity. Just one night to answer a question that'll haunt us both forever if we don't." The argument continued for hours, Caleb wearing down his brother's resistance with twisted logic and alcohol. He played on Ezra's own unspoken doubts, suggesting that perhaps Ezra had wondered the same things, that perhaps he too felt he'd made the wrong choice. By the time the fire had burned to embers, Ezra's defenses had crumbled. They worked out the details like men planning a heist. Caleb would return home briefly, then circle back through the woods. Ezra would leave through the back door and make his way to Ruth. They'd switch clothing first to ensure even the familiar weight of a shirt wouldn't betray them. One night, they agreed, just to know. 3 days later, on a moonless Thursday, when both wives would be alone in their beds, the brothers executed their plan. Caleb slipped into the cabin where Naomi slept, and Ezra entered the home where Ruth waited. In the darkness, neither woman suspected the man who climbed into bed beside her was not her husband. When dawn came, the brothers met in the forest between their properties. Neither spoke at first. Then Caleb smiled, and Ezra understood that one night would never be enough. The second switch happened a week later, then 3 days after that. What began as a single night of forbidden curiosity became a pattern that infected every aspect of their lives. The brothers developed signals, a system of communication that allowed them to coordinate their deceptions with military precision. A red cloth hanging from Ezra's window meant Naomi would be alone that evening. Caleb's axe left leaning against the east side of his woodpile indicated Ruth was expecting him home late. They learned to mimic each other's subtle mannerisms, the way Caleb touched his jaw when thinking, the way Ezra cleared his throat before speaking. They rehearsed conversations, sharing details of their days so that neither would be caught unaware by their wife's questions. The switching became almost routine. Some nights Caleb slept beside Naomi while Ezra held Ruth. Other nights they returned to their own beds. There was no schedule, no fairness to it, just opportunity and desire dictating their movements through the darkness. They justified it to themselves in whispered conversations, claiming it was a victimless deception, that identical twins sharing identical wives was somehow natural, even ordained. By spring, Ruth's monthly bleeding stopped. She told Caleb with shy joy that she was carrying his child, and he accepted her embrace while calculating in his mind whether he'd been the one in her bed during the likely nights of conception. He couldn't be certain. Neither could Ezra, who received similar news from Naomi 2 months later. The pregnancies complicated the deception but didn't stop it. The brothers simply adjusted their system, becoming more careful about timing and frequency. They told themselves the children would be theirs regardless of which brother had fathered them. That blood was blood when it came from identical sources. It was a lie that let them sleep at night, though both men had stopped sleeping well. Ruth gave birth to a son in January. They named him Thomas after the reverend who had married them. The boy had dark hair like his father or father's and eyes that would eventually turn the same stormy gray. When Caleb held him for the first time, he searched the infant's face for some sign of ownership, some mark that would declare paternity. He found nothing conclusive. Naomi's daughter arrived in April, a tiny thing with blonde wisps of hair and her mother's delicate features. They called her Sarah. Ezra experienced the same desperate examination of the child's face, the same fruitless search for certainty. The babies looked like babies and nothing more. The wives devoted themselves to motherhood while their husbands continued the switches with even greater frequency. Sometimes Caleb would spend 3 consecutive nights with Naomi before returning to Ruth, who never questioned his extended absences. She assumed he was hunting or working late on repairs. Naomi made the same assumptions about Ezra. By the following winter, Ruth was pregnant again. So was Naomi. The brothers had long since stopped counting or caring about the timing. The system had become second nature, as automatic as breathing. They switched clothes behind the same large oak tree halfway between the cabins. They coordinated their lies with hand signals across the churchyard. They lived double lives with such practiced ease that they began to forget which life was the original and which was the deception. The children grew, Thomas learning to walk while Sarah babbled her first words, and in the forest between the two cabins, buried beneath falling leaves and accumulated snow, lay the secret that would eventually destroy them all. But for now, the brothers believed they had achieved something remarkable. They had bent reality to suit their desires, and no one suspected a thing. Ruth's second son was born in autumn, a healthy boy they named Jacob. Naomi delivered twin daughters the following spring, naming them Mary and Elizabeth. The cabins filled with the sounds of children, and the wives found themselves spending more time together, sharing the burden and joy of raising multiple small children in isolation. It was during these long afternoons, while the children napped and the women worked side by side preparing meals or mending clothes, that Ruth began to notice inconsistencies, small things at first. Caleb had always been particular about how his coffee was prepared, wanting it strong and black. But some mornings he asked for cream, then seemed surprised when she reminded him he never took cream. He claimed his tastes were changing. There were other oddities. He forgot conversations they'd had just days before, claimed no memory of promises he'd made. Once he reached for his rifle on the left side of the mantel where it had always hung, seemed confused to find it on the right, where she'd moved it weeks ago, after he'd specifically asked her to. When she mentioned this, he grew irritated and accused her of imagining things. Naomi experienced similar contradictions. Ezra had a scar on his left hand from a childhood accident, a pale line across his thumb. But some mornings when she kissed his hand, the scar seemed to be at the wrong angle. Or perhaps her memory was failing. He sang differently sometimes, hymns he used to know perfectly now missing verses. His touch in their bed varied in ways she couldn't articulate, familiar one night and strangely tentative the next. The sisters spoke carefully about these observations, neither wanting to voice the impossible conclusion hovering between them. They blamed exhaustion from caring for young children, the isolation of mountain living, their own confused minds, but the inconsistencies accumulated like snow on a roof, each small oddity adding weight to their doubts. Ruth began testing her husband with small traps. She'd mention a fictional conversation, claiming they'd discussed buying a new plow when they never had. Sometimes Caleb would agree enthusiastically, confirming details of a discussion that never occurred. Other times he'd look at her blankly and deny it completely. She couldn't establish a pattern, couldn't predict which version of her husband would walk through the door each evening. Naomi tried similar experiments. She told Ezra she'd moved their savings to a different hiding place, watched his face for recognition. He nodded absently, but weeks later asked where the money was kept, having no memory of her telling him about the new location. She showed him embroidery she'd supposedly completed just yesterday, and he complimented it as if seeing it for the first time, though it had been hanging on their wall for months. The children complicated everything. Young Thomas had started calling Caleb by his uncle's name, and Ruth corrected him sharply, but the boys seemed genuinely confused. Sarah reached for Ezra one morning and called him Papa, though Naomi was certain she'd taught her daughter to say Daddy. The mistakes were small but frequent enough to be disturbing. One afternoon, while the sisters worked together harvesting vegetables, Naomi finally broke the silence that had grown between them. Do you ever feel like you don't know your husband anymore? Ruth's hand stilled in the dirt. She looked at her sister for a long moment, seeing her own fear reflected back. Every day, she whispered. Neither woman dared speak the suspicion aloud. The thought was too monstrous, too impossible to contemplate, but it had taken root in both their minds, and like the children they'd borne, it would only grow larger with time. The system that had once seemed so elegant had begun to rot from within. Caleb wanted Naomi more frequently, resenting the nights he had to return to Ruth. Ezra, who had initially participated with reluctance, now found himself preferring Ruth's gentler nature to his own wife's sharp tongue. What began as shared deception had become competition. They met less often now to coordinate. Their conversations turned angry and hostile. Caleb accused Ezra of spending too many consecutive nights with Naomi, of monopolizing the woman Caleb believed should have been his from the start. Ezra countered that Caleb was neglecting Ruth, leaving her confused and hurt, risking exposure of their entire arrangement through his carelessness. You're with her 4 nights a week, Caleb hissed during one of their secret meetings in the forest. That wasn't the agreement. There was never an agreement about numbers, Ezra shot back. And you've been just as greedy with Ruth. Don't pretend this is about fairness. The truth neither brother would acknowledge was that they'd each begun to feel ownership over both women. In their minds, marriage to one sister entitled them to both, and the switching had evolved from curiosity into a twisted claim of possession. They no longer saw Ruth and Naomi as individual people, but as interchangeable property that both brothers had equal right to access. Ruth's third pregnancy came as a shock to everyone, including Caleb, who knew he hadn't touched her in over a month. That meant Ezra had been visiting her with increasing frequency, perhaps more than he'd been seeing his own wife. When Caleb confronted him, Ezra showed no remorse. "She's kinder than Naomi," Ezra said flatly. "She doesn't ask questions. She doesn't complain. Why shouldn't I prefer her company?" They nearly came to blows right there, but both men understood that violence would only hasten their exposure. Instead, they settled into a cold war, each trying to outmaneuver the other for access to their preferred woman while maintaining the facade of brotherly cooperation. Naomi noticed Ezra's increasing absences and began staying awake later, watching for his return. Several times she'd seen him emerging from the forest at dawn, his clothes disheveled, moving with the exhausted gait of a man who'd been awake all night. She stopped asking where he'd been, afraid of the answer. Ruth, meanwhile, had grown hollow-eyed and thin despite her pregnancy. She moved through her days in a fog of confusion, no longer certain of anything. Sometimes her husband was tender and attentive. Other times he was distant and cold, treating her like an inconvenience. She'd stopped trying to predict his moods or understand his absences. She simply existed, waiting for whatever version of reality would greet her each morning. The children sensed the tension. Young Thomas, now walking and talking, had started clinging to his mother with desperate intensity. Sarah cried when Ezra picked her up, reaching instead for her mother. The twins, Mary and Elizabeth, were too young to understand but grew fussy and difficult, as if absorbing the household's anxiety through some invisible channel. By the time harvest came, both brothers had stopped pretending their arrangement was sustainable. They avoided each other except when absolutely necessary, communicating only through hostile glances and angry words. The switching continued, but now it carried an edge of vindictiveness. Each visit to the other's wife became a small act of theft, a way to wound and claim simultaneously. Neither man considered stopping. The deception had become their entire identity, and without it, they would have to face what they'd done to their wives, their children, and themselves. So they continued switching, continued lying, continued destroying everything they'd built, because the alternative was confronting a truth neither could survive. The traveling preacher arrived in late summer, a thin man named Silas Cunningham, who'd spent 40 years bringing the gospel to remote mountain communities. He carried his Bible in a leather satchel worn smooth by decades of handling, and his eyes had the sharp, watchful quality of someone who'd seen too much human darkness to be easily fooled. Reverend Gaines had invited Cunningham to stay in the area for a month, preaching at various homesteads and offering spiritual counsel to families who rarely saw clergy outside of Sunday services. The Harlow families volunteered to host him, alternating weeks between the two households. It seemed like Christian charity. It was actually the beginning of their undoing. Cunningham spent his first week with Caleb and Ruth, observing their home with the careful attention of a scientist studying specimens. He noticed how Ruth flinched when Caleb touched her shoulder unexpectedly, how she seemed to study her husband's face as if memorizing it. He watched young Thomas call his father by the wrong name, then correct himself with a confusion that seemed too genuine to be simple childish error. The second week he moved to Ezra and Naomi's cabin. The same odd patterns emerged. Naomi's tension around her husband, the way she'd pause before responding to him, as if translating his words through some internal filter. The children's strange hesitation when their father entered a room, their eyes seeking their mother's face for cues on how to react. But it was the brothers themselves who revealed the truth. Cunningham noticed that Caleb wore his wedding band on his left hand, but one morning at breakfast, the ring had mysteriously migrated to his right hand before returning to the left by supper. Ezra had a habit of scratching his left ear when thinking, except on certain days when he scratched his right ear instead. The preacher said nothing at first. He watched and waited, gathering evidence like a prosecutor building a case. He observed the brothers meeting in the forest, saw them exchange clothing behind the large oak tree. He followed Caleb one evening and witnessed him slip into Ezra's cabin through the back door while Naomi prepared for bed. On his final Sunday in the area, after church services had ended and the congregation had dispersed, Cunningham asked both brothers to remain behind. They stood in the empty church while afternoon light slanted through the windows, and the preacher's face held no mercy. "I know what you've been doing," he said quietly. "Both of you with both wives. I've seen enough to understand the full scope of your sin." Caleb's face went white. Ezra took a step backward as if physically struck. Neither bothered to deny it. The certainty in Cunningham's voice made denials pointless. "Those children. The preacher continued, his voice shaking with controlled rage. Those innocent children have no idea who their real fathers are. You've created a bloodline built on lies and adultery. You've made a mockery of your marriage vows and God's design for family. What are you going to do? Caleb asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Cunningham pulled his Bible from his satchel, holding it like a weapon. I'm going to the county sheriff. I'm going to tell your wives the truth, and I'm going to make certain that everyone in this community knows exactly what kind of men you are. Your deception ends today. He turned to leave, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. The brothers looked at each other, and in that moment, they both understood that exposure meant losing everything. Their children, their land, their standing in the community, possibly their freedom, depending on what laws their actions had violated. They couldn't let him leave. They couldn't let him speak. And in the terrible silence of that church, surrounded by symbols of salvation they'd already forsaken, the brothers made a decision that would damn them beyond any redemption. Cunningham made it halfway down the church steps before Caleb caught him by the shoulder. The preacher spun around, his Bible clutched to his chest, and saw something in Caleb's eyes that made him stumble backward. Ezra blocked the path behind him, trapping the old man between them. "You can't tell anyone," Caleb said, his voice tight with desperation. "Those children need their fathers, the wives need their husbands. Exposing us destroys innocent lives." Cunningham's jaw set firm. "Innocent lives have already been destroyed by what you've done. Get out of my way." He tried to push past Caleb, but Caleb grabbed his arm. The preacher wrenched free, his Bible falling to the ground, pages fluttering in the breeze. When Cunningham bent to retrieve it, Caleb's hands found his throat. There was no plan, no premeditation, just panic and the primal instinct to silence the threat. The old man struggled, his weathered hands clawing at Caleb's wrists, but 40 years of preaching had not prepared him for violence. Ezra stood frozen for 3 heartbeats, watching his brother strangle a man of God on church steps. Then he saw Cunningham's foot kick out, saw the desperate fight for air, and something broke inside him. He grabbed Cunningham's legs, pinning them down, helping Caleb finish what fear had started. It took longer than either brother expected. The preacher's body fought with stubborn vitality, his mouth opening and closing silently, eyes bulging with betrayal and horror. When he finally went still, the brothers held on for another full minute, making certain. Then they released him, and Cunningham's body slumped on the church steps like discarded laundry. They moved without speaking, understanding what needed to happen next. Ezra retrieved a shovel from the church's tool shed, while Caleb dragged the body into the forest. They carried Cunningham deep into the woods to the space between their 2 properties, where they'd switched clothes and coordinated their deceptions for years. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. They dug until their hands bled, taking turns with the single shovel, working through the afternoon and into evening. The grave needed to be deep enough that wild animals wouldn't unearth it, remote enough that no one would stumble across the disturbed earth. They lowered Cunningham's body into the hole, his Bible still in his cold hands, and covered him with dark Kentucky soil. By the time they finished, night had fallen completely. They stood on opposite sides of the grave, breathing hard, covered in dirt and sweat. The enormity of what they'd done settled over them like a suffocating blanket. "We're murderers now," Ezra said, his voice hollow. Caleb wiped his hands on his pants, smearing dirt across the fabric. "We were already damned. This just makes it official." They walked back to their respective cabins in silence, but something fundamental had shifted between them. The secret of their switching had been shameful but shared, a transgression they could rationalize and excuse. This new secret was different. Murder bound them together in a way that felt like chains rather than brotherhood. Ruth asked Caleb where he'd been, why he was so filthy. He told her he'd been helping Ezra repair a fence, that they'd worked late into the evening. She didn't believe him. He could see it in her eyes. But she didn't press further. She'd learned not to ask questions that might shatter the fragile illusion of normalcy they all desperately clung to. In his cabin, Ezra told Naomi the same lie. She accepted it with the same silent doubt. Both wives went to bed that night knowing their husbands had come home different, sensing some new darkness in them, but unable to name it. The brothers lay awake in their separate beds, staring at separate ceilings, bound together by blood and soil and a secret that would poison everything it touched. The murder changed everything. Where guilt over their deception had once been manageable, the weight of taking a life crushed any remaining moral foundation the brothers possessed. They stopped coordinating their switches, stopped maintaining the careful system that had protected them. Each brother acted independently now, driven by impulse and paranoia rather than calculated planning. Caleb became reckless. He'd spend entire weeks with Naomi, barely returning to his own cabin except to grab supplies. When Ruth confronted him about his absences, he'd fly into rages that terrified her into silence. He accused Ezra of trying to steal Naomi away, of planning to expose the murder, of plotting to take everything for himself. Ezra responded with his own campaign of cruelty. He began visiting Ruth exclusively, abandoning Naomi for days at a time. When Caleb discovered this, he retaliated by destroying Ezra's crops, salting his fields in the middle of the night. Ezra countered by releasing Caleb's livestock, watching the animals scatter into the forest. The wives became pawns in a war neither understood. Ruth stopped eating, her body growing skeletal even as she nursed young Jacob. Naomi developed a tremor in her hands that made simple tasks nearly impossible. Both women moved through their days like ghosts, tending children who sensed their mother's despair and responded with constant crying. One morning, Caleb found Ezra in his barn examining his horses. The confrontation erupted without warning, years of resentment and shared sin exploding into violence. They fought with fists and farm tools, Caleb splitting his brother's lip while Ezra broke two of Caleb's ribs. They separated, bloodied and gasping. But the fight solved nothing. "You're destroying both families." Ezra spat blood onto the ground. "This has to end." "Then leave," Caleb snarled. "Take Naomi and go. I'll keep Ruth and the children." "They're my children too," Ezra shot back. "At least some of them are. Or have you forgotten that we don't actually know who fathered which child?" The truth hung between them like a noose. 7 children between 2 cabins, their paternity scrambled beyond any hope of determination. Thomas might be Caleb's or Ezra's. Sarah could belong to either brother. The twins Jacob, all of them existed in biological limbo, their blood ties uncertain. "We should have stopped after the first night," Ezra said quietly, his anger deflating into despair. "We should have confessed to our wives and begged forgiveness. But we didn't," Caleb replied. "And now we're murderers. There's no forgiveness for what we've done. No redemption. We're damned, brother. The only question is how much more damage we'll do before it all comes crashing down." They parted that day without resolution, their brotherhood shattered beyond repair. The switching continued, but without any pretense of cooperation. They sabotaged each other constantly, small acts of destruction that accumulated like poison. Ezra would hide tools Caleb needed. Caleb would spread rumors about Ezra's failing crops. Each brother worked to undermine the other while maintaining the deception that had started everything. The children grew older in this atmosphere of barely contained violence. Young Thomas, now 6, had stopped speaking entirely. Sarah rocked herself to sleep each night, humming tuneless songs. The younger ones cried at the sight of their fathers, sensing the darkness that clung to both men like a shroud. In the forest between the properties, Silas Cunningham's body lay in its shallow grave, the earth above it gradually settling. Sometimes when the wind blew through the trees at night, the brothers could swear they heard the old preacher's voice, calling out their sins to an indifferent sky. But it was only wind, only conscience, only the sound of judgment they'd been running from since the day they first switched places in the darkness. The final confrontation came on a frost-covered morning when winter had just begun to loosen its grip on the mountains. Caleb found Ezra in the forest, standing near the spot where they'd buried Cunningham. His brother held a shovel, and for one terrible moment, Caleb thought Ezra was planning to exhume the body, to turn them both in and end the nightmare through confession. "What are you doing?" Caleb demanded, his hand instinctively moving to the knife at his belt. Ezra turned slowly, and Caleb saw something had broken behind his eyes. His brother looked hollowed out, a shell of the man who'd stood beside him at that double wedding ceremony years ago. "I can't do this anymore," Ezra said. "Every time I close my eyes, I see his face, Cunningham's face. Every time I touch Ruth or Naomi, I feel his blood on my hands. So you were going to dig him up, confess everything." Caleb's voice rose with panic and rage. "You'd destroy us both, destroy our children. Put our wives through that horror just to ease your conscience." "Our children?" Ezra laughed bitterly. "We don't even know which ones are ours. We've created a generation of confused blood, Caleb. These kids will grow up not knowing their real fathers. They'll marry, have children of their own, and this lie will ripple forward forever." Caleb took a step closer, his hand tightening on the knife handle. "I won't let you confess. I won't let you take everything from me." "You already took everything from yourself," Ezra shot back. "We both did. The moment we decided to switch places, we forfeited any claim to an honest life, and when we killed that old man, we sealed our fate." The argument escalated quickly, years of accumulated resentment and guilt exploding into raw violence. Caleb lunged forward, his knife drawn, but Ezra swung the shovel, catching his brother across the shoulder. They grappled in the frozen dirt, 2 identical men trying to destroy their mirror image, each blow landing like self-mutilation. Caleb's knife found purchase in Ezra's side, A shallow cut that drew blood, but not enough to stop him. Ezra brought the shovel down again, this time connecting with Caleb's skull with a sickening crack. Caleb stumbled backward, his vision blurring, blood streaming down his face. He charged forward blindly, tackling Ezra to the ground. They rolled across the forest floor over the grave where Cunningham's body rotted beneath them, their violence desecrating the ground twice over. Caleb's hands found his brother's throat, squeezing with the same desperate strength that had killed the preacher. But Ezra was stronger, younger by 3 minutes, and he managed to throw Caleb off. The knife lay between them in the dirt. They both saw it simultaneously. Ezra reached it first, his fingers closing around the handle just as Caleb lunged. The blade went in cleanly, sliding between Caleb's ribs and into his heart with almost no resistance. Caleb's eyes went wide with shock and something that looked almost like relief. He fell forward into his brother's arms, their identical faces inches apart, blood bubbling from Caleb's lips as he tried to speak. No words came, only a wet gurgling sound and then stillness. Ezra held his dead brother, feeling the warmth leave his body, and something in him shattered completely. He'd killed the only person in the world who truly understood what he'd become, the only person who shared his guilt and shame. Now he was alone with it, with all of it, and the weight was unbearable. He looked at Caleb's face so identical to his own, and understood that he'd just killed himself, not metaphorically but literally. They were the same person wearing different names, and now half of that person was dead while the other half remained to carry twice the guilt. Ezra buried his brother in the same grave as Cunningham, digging deeper into the frozen earth until both bodies lay stacked in the darkness. He spent 3 days pretending nothing had happened, switching between the two cabins as both Caleb and himself, maintaining the deception even as madness crept through his mind like frost. He'd tell Ruth he was Caleb, then forget and mention things only Ezra would know. He'd hold Naomi and call her by Ruth's name. The children sensed something fundamentally wrong, clustering together in corners and watching him with frightened eyes. Young Thomas refused to come near him at all. On the 4th day, Ruth went searching for firewood in the forest. She followed a trail of disturbed earth, her feet carrying her to the place where the ground had been recently moved. Something white caught her eye among the dark soil. She knelt and brushed away the dirt, revealing fabric, a shirt, then a hand pale and stiff. She recognized Caleb's wedding ring before she recognized his face, the gold band she'd placed on his finger that February morning years ago, now circling the finger of a corpse. She screamed, but the sound died in her throat when she saw the second body beneath his, the preacher, the man who'd vanished weeks ago without explanation. Ruth ran to Naomi's cabin, bursting through the door without knocking. Naomi was nursing little Elizabeth, but she saw Ruth's face and immediately stood, the baby forgotten. What happened? Caleb's dead, Ruth gasped. Buried in the forest with the preacher. Someone killed them both. They found Ezra in Caleb's cabin, sitting at the table with his head in his hands. When he looked up, both women saw the confession written clearly on his face. He didn't try to lie. The capacity for deception had finally exhausted itself. It was an accident, he said hollowly. The preacher discovered what we'd been doing, the switching. He was going to expose us, destroy everything. Caleb panicked. We both did. And after that, there was no going back. Switching. Naomi's voice was barely a whisper. What switching? So Ezra told them everything. How it started with one night of curiosity and became years of systematic deception. How neither brother knew which children were truly theirs. How they'd murdered to protect the secret, then turned on each other when the weight of it became unbearable. He spoke in a monotone, reciting facts like a man already dead, just waiting for his body to realize it. The wives listened in horrified silence. When he finished, Ruth asked the only question that mattered. Which of my children are yours? I don't know, Ezra admitted. We stopped keeping track after the first year. Thomas might be Caleb's or mine, Jacob the same. We were identical, so we told ourselves it didn't matter. But it does matter. It always mattered. Naomi's hands shook as she reached for Ruth's arm. The children, she said. All 7 of them. They don't know who their real fathers are. The 2 women looked at each other, seeing their own devastation mirrored back. Their marriages had been lies. Their children's parentage was uncertain. Everything they'd believed about their lives had been built on deception and murder. Ruth turned back to Ezra with empty eyes. You need to leave right now. Take nothing. Just go. The sheriff will come looking, Ezra said. When they find the bodies, let them come, Ruth said coldly. We'll tell them everything, but you won't be here to face it. You'll run like the coward you are, and you'll spend the rest of your life knowing what you did to us, to those children. Ezra stood slowly, understanding he had no right to argue. He walked out of the cabin into the gray morning, leaving behind 2 women and 7 children whose lives he'd irrevocably destroyed. He didn't look back. Ruth and Naomi sat together in the cabin as the children played outside, unaware that their world had just shattered. The sisters held hands, 2 identical women bound by identical trauma, trying to comprehend how they would explain this to their children. How do you tell a child that their father might not be their father, that their uncle was also their father, that the man they'd called Papa had been 2 different men pretending to be one? The truth would follow these children forever. When they grew and married and had children of their own, the confusion would ripple forward through generations. The Harlow bloodline would carry this stain, this uncertainty, this horror. And in the forest between 2 now empty cabins, 3 bodies lay buried in Kentucky soil. 2 brothers who'd destroyed everything they touched and 1 preacher who'd tried to stop them. The earth would keep their secrets, but the living would carry the consequences. If this story disturbed you, if it made you realize how one decision can poison generations, then click that like button right now and subscribe. We bring you the darkest documented cases from history, stories that remind us how fragile truth really is and how devastating deception becomes. These aren't just stories, they're warnings. Share this with someone who needs to understand that some secrets are too heavy to carry and some lies too destructive to tell. See you in the next one.